You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. If you are new here on Break Time Tech Talks, welcome. I would encourage you to check out the first episode in the series where I introduce what this podcast is all about and provide a little bit of my background. It really just sets the stage for the things we talk about here on the show, as well as just my goals and my aims for this podcast. It's actually really rainy and dreary here today outside, but I have a couple of things to follow up on that I've mentioned in previous week's episode, and I want to do that today. I've played a little bit more with the Aura CLI that I talked about last week, and I have some important updates on that. Then I was working a bit more with the experimental GenAI Java library, and that dropped me into a couple of more learnings, and then adding the Cypher DSL library to my repertoire and experience this week too, and some things that go along with that. Lastly, I came across a fun and interesting article on a developer turned baker with a bread making GitHub repository. Without further ado, let's start right in. The first thing I explored was just looking at the Aura CLI a little bit more. I talked about this last week, that I was getting started with it and ran into a couple little issues and wanted to kind of follow up this week. And I found out that there's actually two different versions of the Aura CLI. There's a Neo4j Labs version, which is kind of the incubator or beta version of the project. And then there's the official Neo4j released product version of the Aura CLI. And that was the most recent release. I looked and I was using the Labs project when I was running into some of these issues. I was getting an error access denied when I was running the command that just listed my instances. And so I pinged a couple of folks internally and discovered that there were actually these two different versions, the Labs version and then the official product version. There currently is not documentation for the product version just yet, but I have seen the documentation. It's just not published and available on the web just yet. That should be there soon though. And then also I wanted to note that the Google search currently pulls up the Labs version as the top results, but hopefully that will also be getting solved too. So just keep an eye out in the URL. If it says something about Neo4j Labs, then that's going to be the Labs or beta version of the project. And then if you don't see that Labs add-on inside the URL, then it's going to be the official product version. So just keep an eye out for that. I will link the official product version, the GitHub project of the product, on the show notes. So take a look at that one. But the steps are that you download the compressed file for your specific operating system. You will create an API key in the Aura console. So that does require going out to the browser and logging into your Aura console and creating an API key. And then you'll go back to the CLI and configure the CLI for that key. And that sets you off to the races. Again, documentation is coming. There's a little bit of detail inside the GitHub project, but there will be more information coming out about that hopefully soon. Then I was also following up a little bit with the Neo4j GenAI Java library that I talked about experimenting with a few weeks ago. And I came across an issue where I was trying to spin the project back up and connect to a local instance that I was running through Neo4j Desktop. If you're not familiar, Neo4j Desktop is a downloadable application for your machine that you can spin up, tear down, add plugins to local instances of Neo4j. And I occasionally spin this up and run it, but I kind of ran into a little bit of a gotcha. Not really a bug, it's just something that I didn't realize this is how it worked. So I was having trouble connecting the application that I was building to my Neo4j instance. It just didn't look like it was able to connect to the database at all. The default connection for a Neo4j instance running locally is localhost port 7687, which is the Bolt port. I never even thought to check this. It's always localhost 7687, right? Well, I actually realized that the Bolt port for this specific desktop instance was showing 7689. So I had a little bit of a mild panic that somebody had changed the default Bolt port and kind of was figuring out what's going on, where did I miss this, etc. And I pinged some folks internally and they're like, don't worry, it didn't change. But there is this little bit of a gotcha inside Desktop where if you have an instance running locally inside Desktop and you try to spin up a new instance while that existing instance is running, it will modify the default bolt port for that new instance and increase it. So even if you shut down both instances, you go several weeks, days, months later, and you spin only the one instance, the newer one, back up, that it still sets that default to the higher bolt port number. That's why it was showing the 7689. I must have, when I created this instance, already had an instance running that was using the 7687. And so it set the default port to something higher, and I didn't realize it. Just so you know, if you, for some reason, cannot get something to connect, just make sure your connection credentials are actually what you expect them to be. And I modified that within my application, changed it to the 7689 that desktop instance was showing, and all of a sudden everything ran fine. That was the problem. It did fix it. So just as a heads up, if you're running local instances through Neo4j Desktop, there is a little bit of a gotcha. Just make sure you know what that connection string is before you try to use it. The other thing I got to play with this week using that GenAI Java library that I've been talking about is that, as with a lot of GenAI frameworks, with Neo4j, you often will run the vector similarity search, and then you'll run an additional retrieval query. If you've seen LangChain or some of the other frameworks out there, you'll typically find similar results to the input, which does that vector similarity search, and then you go back out to the database and you pull extra related information, additional context, and so on, that's alongside and stored connected to those similar results. And the way that this GenAI library does it is it uses the Cypher DSL library, which I was really excited about, actually, because I've had the Cypher DSL library on my, to play with list for a long time now, and I'd never really gotten a chance to do it. So this was my excuse to be able to dive into that just a little bit. I got to play with some things, ran into a couple of bumps trying to figure out which methods and how to construct the code, in order to call these certain Cypher clauses and do the filtering and things. I found there were a few things that I just felt were missing some examples in the documentation. I hope then that I can put together some content, maybe blog posts or so on, kind of detailing some of these things and show how to use the things that I was trying to get it to do. But this was really fun to play with. I'm looking forward to getting to experiment a little bit more with the Cypher DSL library. The piece of content I wanted to look at this week is actually a fun one I came across in one of my newsletters. It's called Flour, Water, Salt, GitHub. The bread code is a sourdough baking framework. The title is actually a play on Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which is a Netflix series, also a website with lots of other content. But this article was put together talking about baking bread. And baking is something that a lot of people took up in the last few years, especially since the pandemic. But this article's author expressed his frustration with creating artisanal pancakes. So every time he would try to make bread, he would end up with artisanal pancakes, something that didn't rise and get a good crumb. He was having trouble getting the desired result out of the bread. It just wouldn't be quite tall enough when it would bake. Even after referencing a lot of tutorials, trying to find hacks, the trouble still remained. So this author decided there's got to be something else, and that's when he ran across a GitHub repository from a developer turned bread baker that contains all the resources and background info to get good bread. There's actually a hard copy of this book and a PDF download of this GitHub repository as well. It's the wonderful thing about GitHub code repositories. There's lots of different ways that you can export and produce the content. But the content is going to start with an overview. It digs right into the science behind the reactions and the ingredients in bread, talks about the inputs and outputs that give you various things and the chemical reactions, and it goes in depth on errors and how to debug them. I really love this approach, not only as someone who likes watching baking shows and as someone who is kind of a hobbyist baker myself, but also as a developer. I've mentioned this on the show before that devs often will copy paste code, but we really truly master and manipulate code into exactly what we need by understanding what's going on under the hood. And with a resource like this, we understand that bread works the exact same way. If you understand how the ingredients are reacting to one another, how long to let it rest, how long to knead it, how to get the chemical reactions that you're looking for, it helps you produce the exact outputs that you want at the end. Honestly, you don't really just have to look at mashups of coding and baking. You could apply this to any skill and mash these up. I'd love to see more mashups like this one, honestly. But this was a really fun, interesting one that just goes to show you that the things that you learn in coding can be applied to other topics and other subjects and skills as well. We covered a lot today, kicking off with learning about the Neo4j official CLI, a desktop gotcha, and the Cypher DSL library. Then we looked at an article about the bread code and how baking sourdough has elements in common with coding too. Have a wonderful weekend. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.